Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, how can we fix economic disparities stemming from unequal opportunities at work? We speak to a renowned activist and author on what can be done to address America's racial inequalities in the boardroom, classroom, and beyond. That and our poll up next.
Hi, I'm Nina Melendez. Welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It is February 22nd, and here's a look at some of the top headlines trending on LinkedIn. Dozens of Boeing jets are grounded, NFL wants to double TV right fees, and why doctors can't get hired. Let's take a deeper dive into that last story. Thousands of newly minted medical grads have been shut out of residency programs, a critical point of entry into the profession. According to the New York Times, as many as 10,000 doctors are currently unmatched in the US. The result for these grads, stalled careers and mounting student debt. That story generated a lot of comment on the platform, one by Larry Anderson, who says, "I've been a physician for almost 40 years. The residency issue has been a problem since then. There needs to be a concerted effort to increase the number of residency positions across the country to solve the physician shortage. This is going to take staffing, commitment, and money." And Claudia Meyer says, "Often these feelings of rejection and inadequacy begin even at the conception of wanting a career in medicine. Am I good enough?" This is a question that is reigned in the minds of so many med students, and even in those who have done it all and earned the medical degree. Will we ever be good enough for this increasingly critical system? Thank you both for joining the conversation and posting your comments. For more conversations like these, you can check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed, or if you're on mobile, you can click into that search box. Almost a year after George Floyd's murder and the so-called racial reckoning happening here in the country, we continue to see race-motivated attacks, this time aimed at Asian Americans. The otherism persists in spite of unprecedented condemnation from business leaders following last year's protest. What is the solution, and how do we achieve equality and safety in our classrooms and the boardrooms and beyond? Well, here to help us unpack all of that is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He is the co-author of 400 Souls and the founding director of Boston University's Center for Antiracist Research. He joins us now as part of our Conversations for Change series. Dr. Kendi, we're so glad you're joining us here today on LinkedIn.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with the book 400 Souls. Why did you write this? Why now?
Well, I think one of the reasons why I think Americans are so divided, why Americans don't see people who don't look like them in the same way they see people who look like them is because we don't understand and know and have been taught American history, and we certainly haven't been taught African American history. And so we wanted to bring together a community of writers to write the history of a community, and we put together an extremely accessible, sort of sweeping history of Black folks that we think will help people to better understand that the racial problem has never been Black people, and the racial problem has been our policies, which we need to change.
Why do you suppose that there isn't enough education in the classroom?
Well, I think that it is one of the most politically sort of charged spaces in our country, because if you are in a position of power, you want people being educated to believe that you are the solution as opposed to the problem, to make a long story short. And throughout American history, we've had powerful people who've used our educational system not as a place and a space for truth-telling, but a place and a space where people will look upon the status quo as normal in the way it should be.
So you teach at Boston University as well, and I won't hold it against you because I'm a Northeastern University gal, undergrad. But I'm curious what your students are saying. If when you are having these discussions with your students, are they surprised at what they are learning? How engaged are they? What are you seeing?
Well, I generally am having to respond to students who are upset that really for the first time, they're learning about the history of Black folks or the history of racism. And they're upset that this wasn't taught to them earlier. Even high school students, are upset. Even middle school students are upset. I mean, this is such a critical part of our nation and our nation's history. And our young people are upset that we're not teaching it to them earlier.
I loved the book 400 Souls. I love that you started with the landing, the White Lion, right? The ship. We know the Mayflower, and we don't know the other ship that brought slaves. I'm curious if there's something specific that your students are saying that's like, I had no idea, or why wasn't I taught this?
Well, I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones's sort of opening piece, which sort of covers from 1619 to 1624, and she was one of 80 writers who we each asked to write a small piece on 5 years of African American history, amounting to 400 years, and she wrote about in her piece how we're taught about the Mayflower, which arrived in 1620. As almost the start of American freedom, and we worship and we are taught to admire the Mayflower, but we're not taught about the White Lion, which arrived in 1619 with 20 or odd enslaved Black people, which was the beginning of American slavery, and oftentimes that's part of the problem. It's not as much as what we're teaching; it's as much as what we're not teaching. And we oftentimes want to talk about American freedom, and we don't want to talk about American slavery.
The chapter on Plessy versus Ferguson, I think what that stood out to me was just how difficult it is to actually find the history and ancestry of Black folks in this country. I'm curious what you think about that and the impact that has on today's Black folks, of not being able to trace your history as easily as, say, their people's white counterparts.
Well, I think it's something that if you are not wealthy, if you did not leave a trove of papers or manuscripts or even books, and you're just an ordinary person who's a teacher, or you're an ordinary person who's a secretary or a trash collector, and oftentimes we write a history from the top down, as opposed to a history that is reflective of the majority of people. So one of the things we wanted to do in 400 Souls is write about those ordinary Black folks who we have never sort of been told about, just like we're not told about ordinary Americans in the past. And because ordinary Americans, ordinary Black folks are more like us than these, grand sort of historical figures. And I think people can relate to those stories because they can relate to them in their current moment.
What has been the response from your book? What have you heard?
People have been excited. And I think people are excited for a number of different reasons. I think people like that the pieces, the 80 pieces that cover 5 years each, are these bite-sized pieces, so people can, really, but they're powerful, and people can really wrap their heads around and move through the book pretty quickly. I think people have been excited because the book is beautiful. Like, the cover, the text, we really wanted for the book to be emblematic of really the beauty of Black history. And people have also been moved because they're just learning so much, and even learning things about extraordinary people that they did not know, or extraordinary things like the White Lion that they feel they should have known.
Yeah. I want to pause for a second, Dr. Kendi, and say hi to some of the members who are joining us live on the stream. We have Gary from Pennsylvania, Koya from Illinois, Charm from Wisconsin, and Stephen from New Jersey. Stephen from New Jersey, thanks for joining us again on LinkedIn News Live. I want to talk about, Dr. Kendi, some of the economic impacts of the racial inequality that we continue to see today. I'm curious what your idea is of the biggest impediment to economic equality in this country?
Well, I mean, I think that there's so many, but one of the impediments is because many of us are taught that those who have less because there's something wrong with them, because they didn't work as hard, because they didn't save as much. And there's certainly individuals, like that. But we're taught that whole groups are like that. Whole classes, whole races, whole genders, are like that. Which I think doesn't speak to the root of the problem. To give an example, people say that the reason why there's this racial wealth gap and the reason why white folks have 10 times the median wealth of Black people in this country is because Black people don't want to save. But when you actually look at the data, you find that when controlling for income, Black people save just as much as white people do. You have people who imagine that it's because Black folks are financially illiterate. But again, there's no evidence that supports that. So if the problem isn't poor people or working class people or Black people or women, then what else could be the problem? It's our policies and practices. And so ultimately, I think we have to ensure that we have policies and practices in place that truly allow for people to thrive.
So you're a huge proponent of not changing people's hearts, but changing policy, right? Of that is the solution. Can you go a little bit deeper into that?
Sure. So I mean, the first great economically viable powerhouse system in this country was slavery. And the reason why people, particularly white folks, enslaved my ancestors was first and foremost to make money. It wasn't because they were ignorant or they were hateful towards Black people. And because of that ignorance and hate, they then thought that Black people should be enslaved because we're inferior. And then because of those racist ideas, they instituted racist policies that substantiated slaveholding. No, it was a recognition of how profitable slavery truly was, which allowed this small group of super rich white slaveholding families by the time of the Civil War to be among the richest and most powerful group of people in the world. And they faced abolitionists, whether people who were enslaved calling for the end of slavery or people, in other states who were saying that, no, slavery is wrong. And so then they defended themselves by saying, no, slavery is right and those Black people are wrong.
But you said it wasn't rooted in hatred? You don't think it was rooted in economic, a strive for economic growth and wealth and not hatred?
But what happened is, so then the economic self-interest was the driver of racist policies. And then the racist policies had to be substantiated by racist ideas. And then people consumed those racist ideas. And that's what actually led to their ignorance and hate.
Interesting. I'm curious, that's interesting for me to hear, because there are other ways to grow your self-wealth, your family wealth, to than taking another person who looks different from you and enslaving them. So they didn't do that with their children. They didn't sell their own children for for more land or for money. But that's a very interesting perspective that I haven't heard before, that it wasn't initially rooted in hatred.
Yeah, I mean, just like, for instance, today, there are some elected officials who realize that the majority of the people in their district, in their state, are not favorable towards them. So one way for them to respond is to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to change the policies that I've been supporting. I'm going to change the type of things that I've been saying. to make it more representative of my constituents so that they will then vote for me. But instead, some elected officials are like, no, I'm going to instead suppress the votes of those people and support voter suppression policies and imagine that there's widespread voter fraud to substantiate those policies.
Dr. Kendi, what do you suppose is the biggest misunderstanding between equality and equity in this country?
Sure. So let me give an example. Mm-hmm. In our educational system, there are two ways to reform it. We can say, you know what, all schools and all kids should receive the same amount of resources, just the exact same. And to a certain extent, that's equality. What's equity is to say those students, no matter their skin color, who have the least in their homes should have the most in their schools. That's equity. That's going to ensure that all of our kids will be given a fair shot.
I want to bring up the poll that we've been asking members. It is corporate America doing enough to close racial gaps within its ranks? Yes, for the most part. B, somewhat. C, no, not enough. We'd love to get your thoughts and tell us why you think one or the other. With us is Dr. Kendi. He is a director of for the Center of Antiracist Research at Boston University and the co-author of the book 400 Souls. Dr. Kendi, policymakers will kind of look at sort of past laws that were, I'm thinking of the anti-drug abuse law of 88. And they'll look at something like that and they'll say, oops, we made a mistake, that wasn't a good policy. What do you think is being done currently that we are going to look at 30, 40 years from now and say, oops, sorry, that was, that only exacerbated things?
Wow. I think, where do we even begin? I mean, I think that the biggest thing I would say is there are many Americans who are aware that racism is a problem, but they're only supporting those solutions that can, let's say, gradually create some level of equity. And so I think 30 years from now, when we've made strides, but we're still in a society of racial inequity, we're going to ask ourselves, well, why didn't we think, what can eliminate voter suppression? What can eliminate the racial wealth gap? What could eliminate racial health disparities?
I have a question actually from Andrea in the stream. She says, in your opinion, what is the best path forward to begin the healing process and to begin making real change?
I think when we think about healing as it relates to medicine, the first step in healing is accepting the diagnosis, accepting that there are scholars, that there are experts who use diagnostic tools and have diagnosed this nation as racist. So we accept the diagnosis, and then we are willing to engage in the treatment, even if that treatment is painful. In the way many treatments that are going to bring us healing from a serious illness can be painful, because we recognize that we do want healing, and without progress, without pain, there probably is not going to be some progress.
I think back to your comment earlier that it begins in the classroom, and I'm wondering if maybe that pain part is part of why in early education things like slavery and racism is not taught.
Well, I mean, it's painful if you as a parent, it wasn't taught to you, and then it was taught to your child, and then your child comes home asking you a bunch of questions or even criticizing some of your ideas. That can be hurtful or harmful for a parent. So it's easier to be like, no, don't teach them that because it wasn't taught to you. But no, we have to, why can't our children's generation be the first generation that truly and systemically, learns about racism and really is systematically taught to be anti-racist, meaning systematically taught that the racial groups are equals, and that the problems that we need to fix are not people, but our policies and practices.
I want to take it now to the boardroom and to the workplace. There's a lot of discussion right now in corporate America about diversity and inclusion. And I'm curious what you think of this movement and what we can do to see actual change happen.
I think that if corporations were to take with other problems, there's a very, from my understanding, clinical almost basically investigation of the actual problem, and there's an almost clinical recognition of the solutions that need to be put forth. And there's less of a concern about how it's going to make people feel and more of a concern about what's going to be successful. And so that removes the politics from it and fundamentally focused on the science. And I think if corporations would do this is the problem and this is the solution. And so this is what we need to do in order to, diversify the C-suite, in order to ensure that people of color feel that they can bring their whole selves to the workplace, in order to ensure that we have diverse teams because they're more productive and efficient. So that's what we're going to do, because it's going to make our company better.
Right. And there have been plenty of studies that show that diverse teams actually do help the bottom line and do bring greater economic wealth to each company and each business.
And I was just going to add, and if you're, let's say, a middle-aged white male employee, for you to recognize, you know what, I want my company to thrive so I can continue to thrive. Mm-hmm. So it's important for me, for my company to be better. And so I'm going to support this too.
So is it then to have diversity and inclusion officers? Is it to have better growth within the company of lifting up the folks of color that are already there? Is it the hiring? What's your take?
All of the above.
Okay. Very nice, brief answer. I love it. All of the above. I want to go ahead and say hi to some more members who are joining us from the stream. We've got John from California, Pam from Wisconsin, Diana from Colorado. And I want to bring up a comment from Gary, who says, to anyone who arrived here today rather short in their opinions, perhaps try listening to the discussion today and hearing the alternative point of view being discussed. Dr. Kendi, to Gary's point, what do you want people to walk away with, either when reading your book 400 Souls, or even How to Be an Anti-Racist, or coming to any of your seminars? What do you want people to walk away with?
I think in the case of 400 Souls, as so many people have been saying this month, Black history is American history. So I want people to walk away from reading 400 Souls saying they have a better understanding of American history because they have a better understanding of Black history. And to have a better understanding of American history is to have a better understanding of America. And to have a better understanding of America is to have a better understanding of myself. That's what I want people to take away from that. And as it relates to race and racism, for us to realize we have racial disparities and inequities in our societies between groups. And there's only two explanations. Either it's because of bad policies and bad people. And what I want people to realize is that the problem actually is bad policies. And that's what we need to change, because there's nothing wrong with groups of people.
So you really believe that once policy changes, then hearts will follow?
Yeah, because what happens is people see the value, in a more equitable and just company, in a more equitable and just society. They see it benefiting them. And that's the irony, is I think particularly white Americans are taught this idea that anti-racist policies only benefit, let's say, Black and brown and indigenous people, when in reality, they benefit us all. Now, they benefit those people of color more. So if we ensure that no one's votes can be suppressed, then because Black and brown people and indigenous people are disproportionately, their votes are suppressed, it's going to benefit them more. But white votes are being suppressed too by voter ID laws, by voter purges, by other mechanisms.
So what was it, Dr. Kendi, that inspired you to become an activist and to speak so firmly and vehemently about these issues happening in the country?
Because I love humanity. And because I know that there's so many issues and problems that we view as somehow inherent or permanent, when it's something that we as humans created. So we as humans can eliminate it. And then by eliminating it, we can bring so much joy and eliminate so much pain.
There's currently an uptick in violence against Asian Americans happening right now. And we're, because of the coronavirus, we're almost a year into George Floyd's murder. What are your thoughts on that? That we're continuing to see just people lash out against groups of other people after there seemed to be some sort of reckoning in this country with that. What are your thoughts?
Well, unfortunately, we had, elected officials telling the American people that specifically this coronavirus was a so-called Chinese virus, that somehow Asian Americans are to blame for the mass devastation that has been wrought from this pandemic. And why would those elected officials deflect blame onto Asian Americans? Because they are to blame, right? And so then again, you have people consuming those racist ideas and becoming hateful and going after Asian Americans as opposed to their own elected officials who are the true source of their pain. That's racism in a nutshell. And that's what we have to end.
To me, it sounds like so much misinformation. That it seems that so much of the root of this is just the misinformation of everything.
It is misinformation, and it is misinformation that is specifically produced and created to misinform people, again, to deflect blame, to cause people to think that people who don't look like them are the source of their pain, which then prevents them from joining with those people to actually create a better society for us all.
I actually want to bring up the poll one more time so people can weigh in. We have been polling professionals on the platform. Is corporate America doing enough to close racial gaps within its ranks? Yes, for the most part. B, somewhat. No, it's not enough. Please let us know your answers. We'll address those at the end of the show. Dr. Kendi, Christine asks, I do not care how people feel about people of color, just to break down the racist structure. I'm sorry, I think she's saying she doesn't care how people feel, she just wants the racist structures eliminated. So sort of in line with what you're saying about policy. And Henry says, our policies have changed over the years. We have seen results for the better in terms of racial equity and integration. Always more progress to make, but let's not minimize our achievements. So I'm curious what you think, Dr. Kendi. Do you think when you look over the last 10 years that there has been a lot of advancements made?
So what's ironic is there's been both, right? There has been advancements made in the sense of creating more opportunities and even creating more equity, but there's also been what I call racist progress. And so, no, currently there are not grandfather clauses preventing people from voting. Currently there are not poll taxes in the old traditional sense preventing people from voting. But there are new poll taxes where a former felon has to somehow pay off all her fines in Florida before she can get her voting reinstated. But then she has no idea what those fines are, right? And so what I'm talking about is, that progression in which racist policies have become more sophisticated over time, especially because we've been successfully breaking down those policies or eliminating them, and then they've been resurfacing in a more sophisticated and even detrimental fashion.
What does this solve for that? It's a big question.
Well,
And I know that you have it.
Is for us to not, I think we spend a lot of time hailing our progress, our racial progress, right? You know, it's just like, for instance, if a team succeeds, wins a game, and then they spend the next 5 years so excited about that win, all the while their opponents are back figuring out a way to beat them the next time. And then since we haven't practiced or we haven't defended, we haven't sought to get better or advance our interests, we lose. But then all the while we want to not recognize that loss and still champion that old win.
Dr. Kendi, before we go, I have a question for you. You had a bit of a health scare several years ago, and I'm curious if you had a moment where you were able to sort of see things, your life with clarity. And if so, what is an achievement that you're particularly proud of, something that you're able to achieve with your activism and your books and your writing? And is there something as well that you regret?
Sure. So I think really I am just, the biggest achievement for me is the fact that I'm living. I mean, when you are diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer, just the fact that you're able to still be living, for me, is an achievement. And concomitantly, my biggest regret is there were all sorts of warning signs that I had a serious illness that I did not pay attention to. And so, of course, I regret that I did not catch, that disease earlier, that it forced me to have to go through much more difficult treatment. And ironically, that's an allegory for our country. There are all these warning signs that we're trying to ignore, which are going to cause us, when we finally get to the business of treating this nation, it's just going to make it that much harder.
Dr. Kendi, I appreciate all of the work that you're doing, and continue to write. I love your books, and for anyone who hasn't read, please go out and check out 400 Souls. He co-authored that. It is a wonderful book. We have to leave it at that. Dr. Kendi, thank you again for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Kendi. He is the director of the Center of Antiracist Research, and like I said, he's a co-author of 400 Souls. Let's check in on those poll results that we asked you earlier today. Is corporate America doing enough to close racial gaps within its ranks? So many of you said, no, it is not enough, 53%. Interesting. We really appreciate you weighing in on the poll and giving us some of your comments. Clarine said, the fact that it's 2021 and this is still a question is evidence that not is being done enough to close the racial gaps in corporate America. And Alana says that corporate America can say they embrace diversity and inclusion, but if there is not enough adequate training and diversity in their staff, then they are failing. Thanks again for everyone who participated in the poll. And for today's show. Tomorrow, check out my colleague Caroline Fairchild will be speaking about the IBM study that was conducted over 3,000 CEOs, and what they uncovered will surprise you. What is driving the goals of CEOs this year? I am Nina Melendez. Thank you for watching LinkedIn News Live.